The morning my grandmother was buried, my aunt pulled me aside near the reception table and said, "You know she always loved you best." She was smiling when she said it. I smiled back. 3 weeks later, I understood what that sentence was actually doing. I need to back up. My grandmother's name was Ruth. She was 81 years old when she passed, and she'd spent the last 6 of those years living in a converted farmhouse outside of Asheville, North Carolina, surrounded by apple trees she couldn't eat from anymore, and a vegetable garden she could no longer kneel beside. I visited her every few months. I drove the 4 hours from Charlotte alone, usually on a Friday after work, arriving just in time to help her with dinner. She'd have the radio on, always public radio, always news, and she'd hand me a dish towel without saying hello, like I'd just stepped out for a minute and come back. That was how she showed love. Without ceremony. My mother is a different kind of person entirely. There are 3 of us children. I'm the middle one. My older sister, Harriet, lives in Atlanta, works in commercial real estate, and has a husband named Scott who golfs on Saturdays and talks about his portfolio at dinners. My younger brother, Felix, is 26 and still in and out of things. A lease here, a job there, a new plan every time I call. I am 31. I teach 2nd grade at a public school in South Charlotte. I drive a 2017 Civic with a cracked side mirror. I keep meaning to fix. My mother made it clear, in ways that were never quite direct enough to argue with, that Harriet was the success. Harriet got the graduation trip to Europe. Harriet got the down payment help on her first condo. When Felix needed his car repaired after the accident that was definitely his fault, my mother paid it without a conversation. When I asked once, just once, if she could help me cover a security deposit when I was moving into my apartment, she said she'd have to see. She never saw. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was independent, and that made me stronger. I told myself a lot of things in the car on the way home from family dinners. But grandmother Ruth saw it. She never said it out loud, not in front of anyone. But sometimes when I was standing at her kitchen sink, drying the same dish twice because I wasn't paying attention, she'd come up next to me and put her hand on my shoulder and just leave it there a moment. No words, just wait. Like she was saying, "I see you. You're still here." She died in October, congestive heart failure, which had been building for 2 years. I was with her the last week. I took personal days I didn't have, and I drove up on a Monday, and I slept on the fold-out couch in her living room, and I made her oatmeal in the mornings even though she mostly didn't eat it. My mother flew in on a Thursday. Harriet arrived Friday afternoon with a rolling suitcase and a bag from a specialty grocery store that nobody asked for. Grandmother died on a Saturday morning. It was quiet. The funeral was the following Wednesday. The reading of the will was scheduled for the Friday after, at the offices of her attorney in downtown Asheville. My mother had mentioned this several times in the days between. She mentioned it the way people mention weather, casually, informatively, like it wasn't something she'd been calculating. I didn't let myself think about it. I had never once sat around imagining what my grandmother might leave me. That felt like the wrong way to love someone. So I showed up on Friday in the same dark blazer I'd worn to the funeral, parked on a side street because I didn't want to pay the garage, and walked 3 blocks to a brick office building that smelled like carpet cleaner and old paper. My mother was already there. Harriet was there. Felix had driven up that morning looking like he hadn't slept. We all sat in a row of chairs in a conference room with a long table and a window that looked out onto a parking deck. The attorney's name was Mr. Calloway. He was around 60, wore wire-rimmed glasses, and had the manner of someone who had done this many times and felt the weight of it every single time. I appreciated that about him. He opened the file. My grandmother's estate included the farmhouse and the 2 acres it sat on, her savings account, a small investment account she'd built slowly over 40 years, her car, and the contents of the house. The total value had been appraised at approximately $840,000. Most of it was in the property. Mr. Calloway read through the distribution. The farmhouse and land went to my mother and her brother, my Uncle Dale, jointly, with rates of first refusal if either party chose to sell. That was the largest piece. The savings, around $60,000, was split between Harriet and Felix, $30,000 each. There was a small bequest to a local literacy nonprofit my grandmother had supported for years, and then Mr. Calloway looked up from the page and said my name. He said I was to receive the contents of a storage unit my grandmother had been renting on the edge of town, along with a sealed envelope she had specifically requested be given to me at the time of the reading, not before. That was it. The room was very quiet for a second. Then my mother laughed. It was a short sound, not loud, and she caught it quickly and pressed her fingers to her mouth. But I heard it. Harriet looked at the table. Felix looked at me. I kept my face still. I had learned that from Ruth herself. Mr. Calloway slid the envelope across the table to me. It had my name on it in her handwriting. Small, precise, slightly tilted to the right, the way she always wrote. I held it in both hands and I did not open it. My mother said something about the farmhouse and what it might sell for in the current market. Harriet asked a question about the joint ownership structure. The conversation moved on, and I sat there holding the envelope and thinking about how I had spent 4 hours every few months for the past 6 years driving to see her, and how I had spent her last week sleeping on that fold-out couch with the bar that dug into my back, and how I had made oatmeal she mostly couldn't eat. I am not saying I did those things for something in return. I want to be very clear about that. I did them because I loved her and because she was alone and because no one else was going. But it would be dishonest to say that sitting in that chair didn't hurt. It hurt. There's no clean way to describe it. I left as soon as I reasonably could. I shook Mr. Calloway's hand. I said goodbye to my family without meeting my mother's eyes. I walked back to my car in the cold and I sat in the driver's seat with the heat running and the envelope in my lap, and I cried for about 4 minutes. Not dramatically, just the kind of quiet, ugly crying that happens when you've been holding yourself together, and finally there's no one watching. Then I stopped. I drove to the storage unit. It was a facility off a state road, one of those orange-doored places with fluorescent lights and the faint smell of must. My grandmother had included the unit number and a key in a separate envelope that Mr. Calloway had given me alongside the letter. Unit 114. I found it at the end of a corridor, knelt down, unlocked the padlock, and rolled the door up. It was full, not in a chaotic way. Ruth did not do chaos. Every box was labeled in her handwriting. There were plastic bins organized by category. There were pieces of furniture covered in moving blankets. There were framed photographs stacked against the wall in a way that protected the glass. It smelled like cedar and something faintly floral, like the sachets she used to keep in her closet. I stood in the entrance for a long time. Then I opened the envelope. Her handwriting was the same as on the outside. I recognized the notepaper, cream-colored, with a small pressed flower in the corner, the kind she bought at a stationery shop in town that I'm not sure still exists. She wrote, "By the time you're reading this, you'll already know what the will says. I want you to know that I thought about it for a long time. What I'm leaving you isn't the thing with the biggest number. I know that. And knowing you, you've probably already decided that's alright because you've spent your whole life deciding that things are alright when they aren't, and I admire you for it, and I've also watched it cost you. So here is what I'm actually leaving you. In the blue bin on the left, there are the quilts I made when your mother and Dale were children. I made one for each of them, and I made one for myself, and I made one that I never gave to anyone. That one is for you. It has your colors. I made it when you were 7, and I've been keeping it. The furniture against the back wall belonged to my mother. The dining table and the 4 chairs. I refinished them in 1987, and they've been in storage because there was never a house with the right room for them. They'll be in yours. The wooden box on the second shelf from the top, right side, that is where I kept things that mattered. Open it when you're somewhere quiet. There is also the investment account that didn't go through the will because I set it up outside of it on purpose. Mr. Calloway has the paperwork. It isn't $60,000. It's more. I've been adding to it since you were born. I held it back because I didn't want a room full of people to watch you receive something, and I didn't want your mother to have the first reaction. I am sorry for the things I couldn't fix. I am not sorry for the things I did quietly. You were never invisible to me. Not once. Not ever. I love you, Ruthie. Gran, I had to read it twice before it settled. Then I sat down on the concrete floor of that storage unit in my funeral blazer with my knees pulled up, and I read it a 3rd time. The investment account, it turned out, was just under $200,000. My grandmother had been putting money in since I was an infant. Small amounts, mostly, added to over decades, invested steadily and without drama, the same way she did everything. Mr. Pete Calloway called me the following Monday to walk me through the paperwork. He had been expecting my call. She had told him I would need a moment before I was ready to talk numbers, and she'd been right. I don't know exactly when my mother found out. I found out when she called me. It was a Tuesday evening, about 2 weeks after the reading. I was in my classroom after hours, wiping down the whiteboard. She was not screaming. My mother does not scream. What she did was worse. She used that very controlled voice, the one where every word lands precisely, like she's placing each one down on a table with deliberate care. She said she felt the distribution had been handled in a way that seemed designed to cause division. She said she was surprised by the structure of the account. She said, "I think Gran wasn't always thinking clearly near the end." I held the phone and looked at the alphabet strip above the whiteboard. A, B, B, C, C. I said, "She wrote me a letter. She was thinking very clearly. My mother said there might be grounds to contest, that she'd spoken to someone, that she just wanted me to think about what was fair for the family." I said, "I need to go, Mom. I have things to finish up here." She said, "I hope you'll consider." I said, "Good night." I hung up. I stood there for a minute with the eraser still in my hand, chalk dust on my sleeve. Then I finished the whiteboard, turned off the projector, and drove home. I want to be honest about what came after, because it wasn't simple. There were weeks where I second-guessed everything, weeks where I picked up my phone to call her and put it down. My sister texted me once, something vague about family and how Gran would have wanted us to stay close, and I read it and didn't answer for 3 days. When I did, I said I agreed and left it there. I didn't say anything else. I didn't have anything else to say. I used some of the money to pay off what was left of my student loans. Not all of them, but most. I fixed the car. Not just the mirror. I got the brakes looked at, which I'd been putting off because I kept telling myself it was probably fine. The dining table is in my apartment now. It takes up more space than my old table did, and for the first 6 weeks I kept apologizing to it in my head. "Sorry, that's a small room, I know, but it's solid, real wood, 4 chairs that match, a surface that's been in kitchens longer than I've been alive." On Sunday mornings, I sit at it with coffee and I think about my grandmother refinishing it in 1987 alone in a garage somewhere with music on. The quilt is on my bed. It has blues and greens and a thread of gold running through it. She made it when I was 7. She kept it for 24 years. The wooden box had photographs in it, of me, mostly report cards, a drawing I made her when I was probably 5, a note in my child's handwriting that said, "I love you, Gran, to the moon and all the way back." There was a small folded piece of paper at the bottom, her handwriting again. Just one line, "You were the one who showed up." I kept all of it. I called my Uncle Dale a few months after everything. He's my grandmother's other child, a quiet man who lives in Tennessee and didn't say much at the reading. I wasn't sure what I wanted from the call, but I made it anyway. He told me that Ruth had mentioned setting something aside for me years ago, that she'd said, once, that she worried about me and that she thought my mother's way of doing things wasn't fair. He said, "She told me you were the one who came, that meant something." I didn't say much, but after I hung up, I sat with it for a while. There's a version of this story where I feel triumphant, where the ending is some kind of victory lap. I've seen those stories. They're satisfying to watch. I understand the appeal. But that's not what this is. What this is, quieter. It's my grandmother standing next to me at the kitchen sink, hand on my shoulder, not saying anything. It's 40 years of small deposits, added up without ceremony. It's a quilt in blues and greens made when I was 7, kept in a storage unit until she didn't need to keep it anymore. It's a letter that said, "You were never invisible to me." I teach 2nd grade. My kids are 7 right now, the same age I was when she started that quilt. They are loud and they are hilarious and they are learning to read. And sometimes they get frustrated and crumple their papers, and I pick the papers back up and smooth them flat and say, "Let's try again." I wonder sometimes which ones will have someone watching quietly, which ones will have someone keeping a quilt. I try to be that person where I can. I haven't spoken to my mother in 4 months. I don't know what that becomes. I'm not ready to know yet. But I made oatmeal this morning at my grandmother's table in my small apartment in Charlotte, with the quilt folded over the back of the chair and the wooden box on the shelf by the window, and the leaves were changing outside and the radio was on. Public radio, news, and it felt, for a minute, like she was just in the other room. I dried my bowl twice before I realized I wasn't paying attention, and I smiled, because she would have noticed that. I've thought a lot about why my grandmother did it the way she did. She could have told me. She could have called me on any one of those Friday evenings when I was standing at her sink and said, "I see what's happening. I want you to know you're taken care of." She didn't. And for a while, I turned that over in my head like a question I couldn't quite answer. But I think I understand it now. Ruth knew something I was still learning, that receiving something in a room full of people who don't want you to have it changes the thing you receive. It puts a shadow on it. She didn't want that for me. She wanted me to find it alone, in a storage unit, on a concrete floor, in my own time, without my mother's face in the room. She was protecting the moment, not just the money. That's a particular kind of intelligence. Not the kind that shows up on a resume or gets talked about at dinner. The kind that understands people, how they wound each other, how rooms work, how silence can be more honest than any word you could choose. She had it completely. And I think the reason I kept driving those 4 hours, kept showing up, kept making the oatmeal she couldn't eat, is that I recognized it in her, even when I didn't have a name for it. What I didn't see clearly back then was what it was costing me to keep deciding I was fine. That's the part I sit with most, not what my mother said at the reading, not the way Harriet looked at the table. Those things hurt, but they aren't the lesson. The lesson is the years before that. The nights I drove home from family dinners telling myself it didn't matter, that I was stronger for it, that I didn't need the acknowledgement. I was wrong. Not weak for needing it. Just wrong for pretending I didn't. There's a difference between resilience and denial, and I have been calling one thing by the other's name for a long time. What Ruth gave me, more than any account balance, was evidence. Evidence that someone had been watching, counting, quietly building something on my behalf while I was busy convincing myself I didn't need anyone to. She made it impossible to keep telling myself the story where nobody noticed. The letter closed that exit, and once that story was gone, I had to find a truer one. The truer one is this: the people who show up for you are usually not the loudest ones in the room. They are the ones who remember the small things, who notice when you dry the same dish twice, who make something with your colors in it and keep it for 24 years without saying a word. And the people who diminish you, who laugh in conference rooms, who use that careful, controlled voice on the phone, they are not the measure of your worth, no matter how long you've let them act like they are. I'm still figuring out what I'm building. The student loans are gone. The table is solid under my coffee mug every morning. The quilt has gotten softer with washing. And every day I walk into a classroom full of 7-year-olds who are learning that the world can be figured out, letter by letter, and I think about what it means to be someone who watches quietly and remembers. Someone who builds something for a person before that person knows they'll need it. That's who I want to be. That's the whole thing, really.